recording. And welcome to the North Central Climate and Drought Outlook for December. Bridget Mason, who is the assistant state climatologist in Wisconsin, will be our presenter today. And just a couple logistics is that, one, if you have any questions as we go or at the end, you can put them in the question box in the you can put them in the question box. We usually don't monitor the chat very closely, so if you have any comments or questions, put them in there instead. We'll get to those either as we go along, or we will get to them at the end, one way or the other. I'm joined also by Dennis Toddy from the USDA Climate Hub out of Ames, Iowa, and I am Doug Cluck, Regional Climate Services Director for NOAA out of Kansas City, Missouri. So at this point, I think, Bridget, can you come on? Yeah, there you go.
Yes.
Good. Bridget, take it away, and we'll get to the Q&A a little later. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Dennis, and thank you all so much for joining. As Doug said, we'll do an overview of what the North Central region has seen over the last month and a little bit beyond that, which has consisted of a little taste of winter, which is what I'm showing on this title slide with Madison's third coldest day so far this winter. So let's see if I can switch. All right, here we go. So first, a little housekeeping, just to remind you, or if you haven't joined us before, this webinar has been going on for many years and is a collaboration between many entities, both state and federal. If you're interested in watching any past webinars or viewing any slides, you can check out the links in the middle of the slide. And then we hope you join us again next month on January 16th at 1 p.m. for an overview from Dr. Zach Hoylman out of the Montana Climate Office. Now, to give you a little outline of what we'll look at today, we'll start with recent climatic conditions. We'll review autumn as a whole, and then some more recent conditions. We'll talk about some impacts, some eventful weather, and then we'll also talk about outlooks anywhere from the next 7 days to the next 3 months. And then, like Doug said, we'll get to questions. So to begin, let's look at those recent climate conditions. And we're going to start by looking at 2024 as a whole so far, and then work our way toward more recent conditions. And so this map is a ranking of average temperature between January and November 2024, where the pinks, oranges, and reds represent warmer than average temperatures. And what we see across the entire CONUS is that temperature the first 11 months of the year have been much above average or even record warmest. In fact, 7 of our North Central region states are the very warmest on record, where our records go back to 1895, and many other states in the region are nearing record warmest as well. I do want to acknowledge the fact that we might have a little bit of record fatigue where we're hearing the word record a lot, but I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that this is an impressive feat. So please do keep that in mind as you may hear that word record again throughout this presentation. So what about autumn as a whole? So autumn for climatologists is September through November, and these maps are similar to the previous map I showed, but now showing the average temperature ranking for September through November on the left and the precipitation ranking for September through November on the right. And what the left map shows is that autumn was exceptionally warm for our region and really the whole United States. We again see those pinks, oranges, and reds, and I am again going to use that word record because Minnesota, Nebraska, and Wisconsin all had their record warmest falls, and remarkably, all other states in the region saw their top 2 or 3 warmest falls, with the exception of Colorado coming in at number 4. Now, looking at precipitation, the yellows, golds, and browns that we see depict that autumn was warmer than average, and the greens depict wetter than average. And what we see from this map is that it's a little bit less impressive as a whole for the fall. No one in our region had a record warmest or excuse me, record driest or record wettest fall in terms of precipitation. We were generally generally drier for the mid and northern states, Minnesota and Michigan, and even South Dakota and Wyoming ended up nearing some of their driest falls, but no one was absolutely their driest. And then similarly with Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky, they were generally above average for the fall, but nothing drastic. And then Missouri was our lone state who ended near normal. Now, that was fall as a whole, but if we break down the fall, we see two drastically different periods. Now, I won't get into too much detail about the specifics of September and October because those were already covered in the previous two webinars. But what I really want to point out is that the rankings that we just looked at don't paint the whole picture. In this case, particularly with precipitation, where November was autumn's saving grace from being what could have been one of the driest falls on record. So on this top left map, we see that nearly our entire region saw less than 50% of its normal precipitation for the time period between September 1st and October 30th, and even patches in the plains with less than 5% of normal. But things changed on Halloween, where the atmosphere opened up and was able to move systems across our region, and thus we had a drastically different last third of the season. For example, Kansas saw its 9th driest September through October on record, but its 2nd wettest November on record, with a few stations observing over 10 inches for the month, which is highly unusual for November. With temperatures, yes, fall was warm region-wide and for the most of the season until things started to cool down the last few days of November, particularly for the western part of the region. And so now knowing what November plus one day of October looked like, where did that leave us in terms of our rankings? Well, again, on the left, we have average temperature rankings, and on the right, we have precipitation rankings, but now just for November. And what we see is that no one had a record-breaking warmest November, but some of our friends to the east, like Michigan and Ohio and Indiana, they were quite close to a record warm November. And then as we head west, we see more near normal rankings. Precipitation, on the other hand, has a few near breaking states. As I mentioned earlier, Kansas saw its 2nd wettest November on record. A few others were very wet, and most other states in our region were also wetter, with the exception of Ohio, Montana, and Wyoming. And so if we break November into two parts, similar to what we did for the fall, we'll get a little bit more of a story. Just for some background, oftentimes our region gets weather systems in November that transition us from fall to winter, and this November was really no different. It seemed like that transition started to happen in our region around November 20th. Prior to November 20th, things were quite warm, as you can see from this top left map. We had temperatures 8, 9, 10 degrees warmer than normal for November 1st through 19th, with the exception of Colorado and Wyoming. But then on the 20th is when things started to change in the region, when a system came in, brought winds gusting into the 60s in the Dakotas, and ushered in relatively colder air. And then again, we had a couple more systems the last few days of November that brought temperatures down even more. With precipitation, most of the region was very much wetter than normal for the first 19 days of the month. Again, particularly down near Kansas and Colorado, with nearly 800% of their normal precipitation. And even the Ozarks saw an incredibly impactful system that boosted their monthly total. This event, which I'm showing on the left, happened the 4th, 5th of November and brought several inches of rain and caused serious flooding. But then it's as if the faucet really turned off the last third of the month for most of the region, with the exception of the far northern states, seeing a little bit more of precipitation from a few clippers passing over those northernmost states. Now, what has December looked like thus far? Well, we seem to have continued this end of November pattern with relatively little precipitation region-wide, with multiple states seeing less than 25% of their normal precipitation for December 1st through 17th. The exceptions are where we have those blues and greens, such as in Missouri, Michigan, Minnesota, Montana. Now, this is the point where I feel I should remind you that winter is our climatologically driest time of the year, so 200% of normal in the winter is not necessarily going to be the same amount as 200% of normal in the summer. So just a friendly reminder. Additionally, the temperature pattern has shifted since November, where we now see most of the eastern regions slightly cooler than normal and the western states slightly warmer. But some states, such as Nebraska and Minnesota, were reporting that temperatures have felt like a roller coaster throughout December, where we've had these cold air outbreaks, but then the cold isn't really sticking around and we just can't quite get into a consistently normal state. Additionally, some have reported, such as in Wyoming and Kansas, that they are not consistently recording temperatures as cold as they usually would be by this time of the year. On the flip, in Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Dakotas, we have had those more seasonal colder temperatures. Wisconsin saw its coldest temperature of the year so far, which was -25. So yeah, we're a little bit colder. And now, now that we've covered everything from, the year to date to the last 3 weeks, what kind of impacts have these conditions had on us? Well, some of the bigger indicators of how the temperature and precipitation patterns are affecting us are through crops, plants, livestock, waterfowl. And for anyone who is finishing up their row crop season in November, you may have been slowed down a little bit by the precipitation, but otherwise, this was a pretty fast-paced harvest season with very little rain breaks. A few states mentioned that winter wheat seems to be doing better than anticipated, likely because rain fell at the right time and gave those seedlings enough moisture to germinate and emerge despite the otherwise dry conditions. Pastures and rangelands seem to be slowly recovering with the precipitation, with livestock able to graze without snow cover. And some states like Missouri have reported that hay supply is still adequate. In Indiana, rose bushes were in full bloom until mid-November, and similarly, at least one banana tree down in Kentucky was still growing as of November 21st, despite the light dusting of snow received and temperatures hovering around 34 degrees. And one more impact, waterfowl migration was fairly delayed because it was so warm so late in the season that the birds were just not migrating south. For anyone who is a duck or goose hunter, they were not so happy early on in the season because of this delay. But then, as we discussed, it eventually got cold and the birds started moving south. Now, what about drought? How has that been holding up over the past 4 weeks or so? If you need a little refresher, this is what we're working with as of the last November, with exceptional drought in Ohio, extreme drought in the West, and fairly widespread drought throughout the region. Some of the more notable improvements that we could see on this right map between last November 19th and today's US Drought Monitor release, some improvements were Ohio and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan dropping 2 categories, and many patches of 1 category improvement throughout the region. And there were only a few places with worsening conditions. However, looking at the most updated US Drought Monitor map, much of the drought is still widespread. So a lot of the D1 or moderate drought that we see across the region stems all the way back to the beginning of October, and even longer for some, such as Montana or even Iowa, who have had precipitation deficits for 4 to 6 months. And then another impact that has been a result of drought, and something that we might refer to as an ecological drought indicator, is the impact on muskrat traps in Ohio. So because it has been so dry in Ohio, muskrats are intruding on farm ponds. And so to stop the muskrats, farmers are buying traps. And so muskrat traps are at local hardware stores. They're out in all-time low. And this was just something that climatologists around the region thought was quite interesting and thought it would be worth sharing with you all as a ecological drought indicator. Now, thinking about some of the more usual suspects we look at when drought is suspected, we have soil moisture on the left and stream flow on the right. The return to precipitation that we had in November helped us to recharge that soil moisture, mostly in the Midwest. However, now that the precipitation has dwindled over the last few weeks, some of the plains and western states reported that soil moisture is regressing. But that's not too much of a surprise for us at this time because, again, we typically don't expect a lot of precipitation right now, and thus not much soil moisture recharge. Also, fortunately, evaporation and evapotranspiration are low enough right now that they don't really dry out the conditions even more and cause more loss. Now, thinking about stream flows, some streams are still lagging a little bit because when that rain did fall, the soils really just took up most of the moisture and left a little bit of moisture for the stream flow. I know that happened in Illinois, but some streams are already showing signs of rebound as well, such as in Missouri. So quite drastic, quite differences around the region, a mixed bag around the region. But one more thing that's important to note is that the lack of stream flow data that we see in the northern plains, where it looks like a big white spot, it's not necessarily that there are no rain gauges or stream flow gauges. It's just that they're frozen. So we're not getting much of data collection up in those areas right now. Now, how are some of our major rivers holding up with all of this weather? Fortunately, there are no major issues right now on any of our rivers. On the Mississippi, they are monitoring around the St. Louis region as levels are low due to the decreased flows on the Missouri River. Those low levels aren't necessarily abnormal, as that stretch between Missouri, Illinois, around St. Louis typically sees its lowest stages this time of year as supplemental flows from the Missouri River shut off. And because of the low levels, they are monitoring for the threat of ice bites. And this may have been discussed before in previous webinars, but just as a reminder, ice bites happen when the river upstream freezes quickly due to a quick drop in temperatures, and then the river flows drop quickly as a result. And this threatens navigation, particularly when the river level is already so low, like it is right now. There is ongoing dredging of the Mississippi River happening just south of St. Louis, but other than that, we are not currently facing any major transportation or commercial navigation issues at that time, or at this time. Now, on the Missouri River, they've made releases of 12,000 cubic feet per second of water from the Gavins Point Dam in southeastern South Dakota. That happened last Friday, and that water should reach St. Louis next week and will be that final decrease in flow that St. Louis will reach. Recent rains did cause minor flooding in south central Missouri, making it evident that flooding is always possible regardless of how dry things are. There was ice forming on the Missouri River last week to the north and the west, which is normal for this time of year, but that ice has since stopped forming because of the warmer temperatures we've seen this last week. There was a large floating pan of ice near Bismarck, but that has since disappeared too, and water temperatures in North Dakota are hovering around 32 degrees, so the next cold snap should start ice formation right away. And finally, perhaps the best news of all is that the Ohio River is right in its sweet spot of drought improvement and minimal floods. Now, along similar lines of river ice formation, as of Tuesday, the Great Lakes had about 1.2% of ice cover. This onset of ice formation is in the more shallow regions of the Great Lakes, such as Saginaw Bay, Western Lake Erie, and Green Bay. This is right on track with the historical average, as we can see in the historical average red curve of the plot on the right, and the current conditions in that dark line beginning in the beginning of December and going until the middle of December. So we see that we are on track with the historical average, which is good news. In addition to the Great Lakes, local lakes are also freezing over. And when I started at the Wisconsin SCO last January, I quickly learned how much the locals are drawn to lake ice. So I just thought it would be neat to share that 2 of our lakes in the Madison area have officially been deemed iced over this winter, which is near normal based on our records going back to the 1800s. Other states like Minnesota and South Dakota share similar excitement to Wisconsinites when the lakes freeze over. In Minnesota, ice has been much faster to form on the lakes this year compared to last year, but it's happening about a week later than average. And in South Dakota, the lakes actually froze over Thanksgiving week. I've heard several reports of ice fishing. Unfortunately, though, there have been reports of ice emergencies, such as people and vehicles falling through the ice. So please take this as your warning and take cautionary measures if you find yourself itching to get out on the ice. And so now that we've started talking about some of the cold season indicators such as lake ice, let's dive deeper into winter weather and some of what we've experienced thus far in the season. So something that you might be wondering about is how exactly can we define how severe or mild a winter has been? Well, the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index was developed to do just that, where it considers maximum and minimum temperatures, snowfall, and snow depth. And as shown by this very handy tool developed by the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, while it's early in the season, much of the north central region is experiencing mild conditions as denoted by the red and orange dots, while the southern part of the region and a few lake effect spots are more so near average or even in the severe or extreme categories. So let's take a look at what some of these winter-esque conditions have looked like. Well, the Thanksgiving holiday was quite notable this year. Aberdeen, South Dakota had a white Thanksgiving, which is historically only a 12% probability, so that is pretty remarkable for them. And on the right, we have the town of Menominee in northwest Wisconsin, where they had a bit of a surprise on Thanksgiving. An unexpected yet productive snow plume was generated by steam from a factory and created localized hazardous conditions. About a 10-mile stretch of a major highway was completely shut down for about 3 hours, and multiple crashes made for a busy holiday for emergency management and tow truck companies. On December 4th, the Green Bay National Weather Service Forecast Office had their hands full with snow squalls. Thanks to a strong Arctic front that moved across Wisconsin during the day, there was enough oomph in the atmosphere to generate moderate to heavy snow showers and strong winds gusting over 40 miles per hour. Within these squalls, visibility can suddenly drop to a quarter mile or less and create flash freezes on the roads. One note about snow squalls is that they are harder to predict, almost like a summertime thunderstorm, and pose a serious hazard to people, especially those who are on the roads. And unfortunately, there ended up being several accidents reported with this event. And speaking of hazardous road conditions, only last weekend, an ice storm struck Iowa and Nebraska, causing hundreds of crashes, one of which ended in one fatality. So again, just want to use this as a gentle reminder to exercise caution on the roads as we see more winter weather. But hopefully on a brighter note, this ice storm also allowed one hockey player to hit the rink in the streets of Omaha. Now, what you may have been hearing more of lately is the intense record-breaking lake effect snowfall that the Great Lakes region has been experiencing. And you might find yourself thinking, well, why are we having such events? Well, a big reason has been the unusual warmth of the Great Lakes. So by November 24th, Lakes Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario had all broken their records for their record highs for year-to-date average surface temperatures. And this is due to both the warm fall that we had and also due to the notably warm 2023-2024 winter. And so again, why are we having such impactful lake effect snowfall events? Well, when colder air moves over those relatively warm and unfrozen lakes, the warmth and moisture are lifted into the atmosphere, and as that air rises, clouds are able to form and grow into the narrow bands that produce several inches of snow. And we can clearly see this beautiful phenomenon at work on December 12th from that lake effect snow event, with bands of snow being produced off of all 5 lakes. Here are a couple other notable lake effect snow events for you. Over the south and east parts of Lake Erie, what began as another Thanksgiving snowfall event didn't end until December 3rd and produced rates of 1 to 3 inches per hour. By the end of the 5-day event, snowfall amounts ranged from 2 to 5 feet across the snow belt of Northeast Ohio and Northwest Pennsylvania. And one of the highest snowfall totals of this event includes the 63.2 inches in Saybrook, Ohio. On the right, we have the Gaylord, Michigan National Weather Service office on the morning of what ended up being Gaylord's snowiest day on record since the site began recording in 1998, where they saw 24.8 inches of snow on the 29th of November. And so with the snow that we do have, winter recreation is getting back in business after the hiatus of last winter. So the Terry Peak ski area in the Black Hills of South Dakota is making snow and has a few runs open. Snowmobilers in northern Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan are happy, including my dad and his friends. They have a nice base of hard-packed snow, and the continuous snowfall they've been seeing is making conditions quite nice for snowmobilers. And even the Browns and Steelers had fun with their snow during their game in Cleveland the night of November 21st. And of course, all of the resorts, restaurants, and establishments that are dependent on winter recreation are seeing business once again. Now, where do all of these snowfall events leave us in terms of current snow levels and how that differs from normal? Well, while we have had these snowfall events, currently, or at least as of yesterday, most of the region is lacking snow cover. So if we look at the snow depth departure from normal map, the yellows, oranges, and reds depict below normal snow cover. And what we notice is a sea of yellows and oranges, meaning that most of us are below what we normally have on the ground for mid-December. And if we look at the current snow depth or snow water equivalent, most of us see little to no snow. And yes, there are the blues along the Canadian border signaling above normal snow depth, which we can see even some lake effect spots showing up as a result of what we just talked about. However, I do want to point out that with the recently warmer temperatures, these levels may drop over the next week or so. But how does the season to date snowfall compare to normal? Well, looking at this map on the bottom right, it's not looking so great for much of the north central region. Many of those northern states are coated in the tans and oranges, where they have several inches below normal. However, we again have those lake effect regions showing up in the purples, meaning above normal, and even Colorado showing up, which I think can be attributed to the significant snowfall event the eastern Colorado plains saw in early November. One more thing I would like to point out about snowfall is the mountain snowpack water content for the Missouri and Platte River basins. This information is good to know, as this snowpack particularly affects water resources for these basins come late winter and spring. And so the blue shading that we see on these 4 graphs is the snowpack water content for this current season, and the red curves are the average. And what we can note from these graphs is that the water content is running below average. However, I also want to remind you and note that accumulation is still very early in the season, and it would really only take a few really moisture-filled systems to bump up the water content and change these measurements. One last observation I have to share with you for winter weather and winter conditions are our frost depths. So currently soils are frozen down to a couple inches in places like Nebraska, Iowa, southern Wisconsin, all the way to the teens and upwards of 20 inches in the far north. Something to note is that soil temperatures did not really drop until the cold air came rushing in mid-November. As we talked about earlier, the relatively cold temperatures that arrived in South Dakota on November 20th were quite sudden, and because there was no snow cover and because the soils were so dry, the soils were able to freeze very quickly and very deeply. And this is a particular concern if colder temperatures linger around and cause frost depths to deepen. Frozen soils put buried water lines at risk or could cause building foundation issues, which isn't necessarily something that folks to the north experience often, because we typically have snow cover on the ground. Additionally, colder soils can also be a problem for fall seeded crops, depending on what stage they're at. So just a reminder to keep an eye on soil temperatures and frost depths. And finally, we are on the home stretch, so let's talk about the outlook. Now, if you haven't heard yet, we are in a La Niña watch, meaning that conditions in the equatorial or tropical Pacific are favorable for the development of La Niña conditions, and La Niña conditions in the tropical Pacific mean that sea surface temperatures are cooler than normal by about 0.5 degrees Celsius or more, which then influences the atmospheric circulation in the tropical Pacific and thus the atmosphere around us. At this time, while La Niña criteria may not officially be met, the ocean and the atmosphere are behaving in a manner that reflects La Niña in many ways. And so based on what we know is happening in the tropical Pacific and the atmospheric response, we could feel the effects of a weak La Niña, which could result in less typical winter impacts. But you might be thinking, well, what is our typical winter La Niña pattern? Well, the northern plains are typically colder and the Ohio Valley is typically wetter, but of course, not every La Niña is the same and not every situation is textbook like in this graphic. And so what we could be dealing with this winter, if La Niña comes to fruition, may not be this exact pattern. In fact, we have had 9-week La Niña winters between 1959 and 2024. And in those 9 winters, the pattern of snow between January and March was such that above average snowfall was observed for much of the north central region. Now, this figure is not a prediction, but if there are any tendencies for weak La Niña snowfalls, and if the past is any predictor of the future, these are the signals that have been observed. But again, that is if a weak La Niña comes to fruition. And even if it does, there are still other climate signals, longer term trends, and shorter term weather patterns that can disrupt this historical pattern. In any case, though, let's keep in mind that we are in a La Niña watch, and let's look at what our outlooks are suggesting. So here we have a precipitation forecast for today through the morning of the 26th, where we see higher chances for precipitation over the Great Lakes and the southern tier of the Midwest, and lower chances for the plains and western states. Do keep in mind, though, that this is for liquid equivalent precipitation, and whether or not that precipitation falls as a liquid, of course, depends on the temperature. As we end the year, things are certainly looking like they'll be warmer than normal for our region, which unfortunately means the potential for snow melt. However, depending on overnight temperatures and if they can fall below freezing, then these conditions might help create more of a base layer of snow. Chances are also slightly elevated for us to see above normal precipitation. Again, however, keep in mind that wet in December is different than wet in the spring or the summer, as climatologically, December is relatively dry. Nonetheless, it is still an elevated chance of above normal precipitation for us. Now, starting Boxing Day and a couple days following, those in the mountainous west have the potential to be impacted with high elevation snowfall. So as you can see in this graphic, the risk of snowfall is moderate or has a 40 to 60% chance of occurring over far western Montana and northwest Wyoming, which coincides with the higher elevation of the northern Rockies, and then probabilities dwindle to the east and the south. And while this risk of heavy snowfall is not a guarantee, one plus would be that it would increase our snowpack for those areas, but one downside would be the disruption of holiday travel. So please do keep an eye on the forecast if you live in or are traveling to these areas. Looking at the month of January, it's looking quite La Niña-esque, but do keep in mind that we still are uncertain La Niña will officially emerge, and even if it does, it will likely be weak. And so if you recall, a typical La Niña pattern means cooler temperatures for the northern plains. However, chances are fairly equal that temperatures could end up being above, near, or below normal for the month of January for our region. And if you recall from a couple slides ago, the outlook going into January looked very bullish on warmth. We had a lot of reds and maroons, but that warmth could be balanced out by some cooler temperatures later in the month, and thus gives us this equal chances outlook. Concerning precipitation, there is a higher probability that things will be wetter than normal for the Great Lakes, and especially for the Northern Rockies. Looking further ahead between January and March, again, this pattern is La Niña-esque, this time with a little more flavor to the temperature outlook, showing perhaps above normal temps for the far eastern Midwest and below normal, or excuse me, showing above normal temps for the far eastern Midwest and below normal temps for the northern plains. We have a little more confidence in seeing above normal precipitation over the Great Lakes and slightly less confidence over Montana and Wyoming, with equal chances for above, near, or below normal precipitation for the plains. Now, it's also good to look at the seasonal drought outlook, where this outlook suggests that perhaps there could be some drought improvement for the Great Lakes and for far western Montana and Wyoming, and perhaps persistent drought for much of the plains. However, as I've said, winter is our climatologically driest season of the year, so it may be a little difficult to see drought improvement over the next few months. Additionally, just to add it in for a further look ahead, we have the February through April outlook, which is similar to the January through March outlook with a La Niña-esque pattern. However, it's important to note that any La Niña or ENSO effects that we feel in our region do start to weaken after March. Finally, I'll leave you with a summary of some take-home points. Currently, there have been some drought and hydrology recovery, although as we talked about, precipitation has slowed down, which has led to a slowdown in recovery and even regression in some places. Fortunately, there are no major issues on our major rivers, but out of caution and preparedness, they are monitoring the low flows and potential threat for ice bites around St. Louis. Ice cover on the Great Lakes and local lakes is near normal for the most part for this time of year. And lastly, winter is making itself known, although some are feeling it more than others, but that is a huge relief considering where we were at this time last year. Looking at the outlook, the eastern and southern Midwest have the best chances for precip over the next week. However, those of you in the Rockies need to be aware of the potential for significant snowfall after Christmas Day. And of course, we are in a La Niña watch for January through March. And although it is likely to be weak, if it does come to fruition, we could see cooler, snowier conditions. Here are more links and information specifically to our partners. I also tried to add links to every source I used today on each respective slide in case anyone wants to check those resources out. And lastly, here are some points of contact if you want to reach out to us. And with that, thank you again so very much for joining us. And I'll hand it back over to Doug and Dennis. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Bridget. That was wonderful. Yeah, we have a few questions. And just one other thing, can you back up 2 slides? Uno, dos. Yeah, and just want to reiterate something on the potential for cooler and snowier conditions in the north part of the region that we're talking about.
Thank you, Doug.
Not necessarily all the way to Kansas City, and sort of sometimes the southwestern portions of the middle of the country actually stay a little bit warmer than normal. Here in Kansas City, it's a 50-50 shot. We never know on it with a line.
Thanks, Doug.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't specify.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Everything else was perfect there. Dennis, do you have any sort of overall comments you want to make before we get to the questions real quick? Oh, but wait a minute. Before I forget, the key thing here is if you've signed up for this webinar and you plan on participating next year, in theory, I will be able to just extend the same URL, and you'll already be in the list of being signed up for this, if I do it correctly. If not, you'll see a message from me saying, I screwed up, please re-sign up for this. Hopefully I haven't, or hopefully I won't, I should say. I've done it before. Anyway, on to you, Dennis. Thank you.
No, I don't have much else to add. I think it hit the main points and covered it pretty well. Doug, did you want to dive into La Nina a little bit more about the nuance on what we're watching with La Nina?
Well, I guess in short, someone asked, and this gets to one of the questions about what is the source of the map with the mild winter depiction. And so back up, and this is the one I think is being asked about, Diane Mankleger, if you want to, the generic picture. The generic La Nina.
Oh. Yeah, sorry.
So if this is what you're talking about, this is a very generic composition of many La Niñas put together in a very simplistic form. It never works out like this. It's just a general pattern. If you sort of look at all of the La Niñas put together, this often happens, but not necessarily. So that's why this is not a forecast either. The forecast is what Bridget showed a little in a few slides after this. I will say though, the forecast is similar to this, so not that much different. And this is mostly for December, January, February into March, so those colder months. There are some subtleties with La Nina reaching thresholds which are human-made, and the thresholds may or may not hold up well this year, and we still may see La Nina-esque impacts from that across North America. Often that can happen. I'll just leave it at that without getting into great detail. So we're in a watch. We haven't reached the criteria to be a full-blown La Nina yet. The probabilities say that we will. It may be a very short version of it, and it may not be very strong, but we may see the ramifications of this type of pattern, and thus the forecast. To go to the forecast for January, February, March, because that's a better, that's the actual forecast as opposed to that. Yeah, that one. So that's where, in the north, we're sort of hoping for that, especially in the mountains in the west, northwest. And maybe to some degree in the Ohio Valley, without flooding, of course. We just want the perfect amount. Anything else, Dennis?
I mean, the ag impacts are fairly limited this time of year.
Yeah.
So I don't have too much to add from that standpoint.
I will say.
Okay, Doug, I figured out which graphic Diane is talking about now. It's the Aussie. Go back to the Aussie image.
Oh, okay. There you go. Yeah.
And you want to, I don't know, Bridget, do you want to explain that further?
I can if you want me to.
Go ahead.
What was the question? I'm not seeing
the question. Is what is the source of the map with the mild winter depiction so far? Now this is so far, by the way. This is not
sure.
This is not a prediction. This is just what we've seen so far.
Yes, correct. I don't know if I necessarily specified that. This is a, observation-based tool. Now, I I'm not too familiar with the source of this. I got this from the Midwestern Regional
Yeah.
Climate Center. They have this tool that includes the temperatures, snowfall, and snow depth, and then puts it into this map. I honestly am not too much familiar with
Yeah.
it otherwise. I'm sorry to say. I'm blanking right now.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's like you just said, it's looking at how temperatures have behaved so far, and how much snowfall and how much snow depth there is across the region. And where it's red, we've had a relatively mild winter thus far, cool season thus far. Uh, and some of the maps you showed line up with this. If we have an extended period of cold, this will change. If we have a major blizzard, this will change. If we only have one and we look at this at the end of the season, it may not change much because, one big system or, 10 days, like last year, 10, 14 days. Remember the brutal cold we had in January? And the rest of it was pretty darn warm. So last year had a episode, but for the season, it wasn't bad at all. In fact, very warm, and a lot of things got canceled because of it. Yeah, so that's it.
Yeah, and we do want to recognize Midwestern Regional Climate Center, which
Yeah.
houses the project. I'm sure they probably have an about page that would explain it more if you go there.
Yeah,
They do, yes.
and Steve Hilberg and Barb Mays are the ones to attribute actually, those are the two people who put it together, I think. Okay, thank you, Diane. Another question is about,
Winter wildfire.
well, yeah, but let's do the muskrat traps. We really are not, that was a left field sort of comment from the Ohio Climate Office. If you're asking us about beaver too, all I can say is I can guess that beavers had the same issue since they like water. But since beavers build their own dams and maybe secure water, they may have done better. But we're going to need a ecosystem person to maybe chime in on that one. And we're really talking about east southeast Ohio rather than the whole area, and how what did beavers do? Yeah, wildfires, Dennis, or either one of you, or Bridget.
Yeah, I guess yeah, I don't know if there was a specific question, but I did take a look at the fire outlooks and things seem to look normal for the next few months for our region. If that's what they might be wondering, sorry I didn't include those. Was there anything else that Dennis you want to add?
Well, just a little bit more. What we can say is, and this is true in every single year, is that once the snow falls, for the most part, once snow falls and you have a cover, it decreases the chances pretty quickly. As long as the snow stays there, but that tends to moisten things up. It tends to be a bigger issue the further west you go, because sometimes snow is lacking out there, and you can get a wildfire, grass fire for the most part, anytime. If there's no snow, we've even heard of fires on top of snow if the grass is if there's enough fuel above it. But no, I would say generally the concern for wildfire is not high across this region for the most part. Melissa says calculates, produces as okay, yes, MRCC, and all right, comment from Diane, because she knows about these things. Need to separate the population and fur prices from the climate/nuisance impact of muskrats and beavers. For the Aussie, okay, Matt, all right. For the Aussie, could you mention is based on a point system? You acquire points when it's cold or when it snows. The colder and or more snow results in gaining more points than it is compared to points in previous years. Yes, it is compared to history, by the way. That's absolutely true. And
history at that location too.
That's true. And that's where we have long-term records at those points, all those dots, I should say. Okay, that looks like that's it for questions. Anything either one of you would like to continue saying, other than maybe, Dennis, do you want to say anything about the heat next week? And I call it heat, But if you go to the 8 to 14 day outlook real quick, if you will, please. Yeah, that one. Those probabilities on the left are very, very high for temperature in the winter. Now, does that mean it's going to be hotter in well, it's going to be hotter in Madison than it is, let's say, in Los Angeles? No. What that means is the difference, the anomaly is going to be greater in Madison, Wisconsin than it is in Los Angeles, is what that means. So Madison may be 20 degrees above normal and be, I don't know, what's normal right now, Bridget?
Oh gosh, I think like that daily average is around 20 degrees, 21 degrees.
What for a high temperature? What would you say? Well, okay, let's say 25. Let's say 25. It might be 50 degrees in Madison. I'm just throwing out a weird number. It's not directly 1-to-1, but much warmer than normal during this period, and that's great for travel for the most part. Now, I will also say that precipitation outlook is for above normal across almost the entire nation. Where it's cold enough, that could mean snow. It could be above normal temperatures, but you know, what's the difference between minus 30 and minus 10? You still can create snow, right? At 20 degrees, you know, warmer than normal, you're still going to get snow. So watch your forecast. That's all I can say. But this is a pretty warm forecast for the travel and / vacation period holiday period that we're coming up on. And yeah, Glasgow is saying it's been, sorry, Northeast Montana is saying that it's been pretty snow-free here. And the clipper there's been some clippers, we call them clippers because they're really fast-moving. They're relatively dry storms. They have a lot of wind with them. They bring cold air, but it's short-term. And so there's been a bunch of those coming down out of Canada, but sort of staying, well, east, like Minnesota to the Great Lakes, for the most part. Okay. Thank you, Glasgow. Anybody else want to say anything? If not, I'm going to call this done, and I'm going to thank Bridget again and Dennis for their help, and we'll be back in January.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day. Have a great holiday. Thank you, everybody.